You've had a long day because, like many others, you spent the day out in Soweto as part of your own foundation's work to remember Madiba, but I think more broadly, the values. So as today you celebrated the life of Madiba, what are your reflections tonight on what the values about him we can use are in our lives, practical, tangible things?
Well, thank you, Kathy. Good evening, former Minister.
Lady of substance.
That's very kind.
Okay.
I would say the greatest value that drove Madiba was the value of Ubuntu, because it's all embracing. In it is a quest for justice, a quest for fair treatment of everyone, and a deep sense of compassion and a lot of integrity.
And, you know, when you talk about those values, it brings us to humanity. Last night we had Professor Lumumba talking about also drawing some themes out of his life. And he says that one of the greatest tragedies about humanity is that we don't learn from history. And what are the histories that we need to learn from today? And I ask this question in a context where Madiba's legacy has perhaps faced the greatest onslaught that it has ever.
Well, thanks for referring to the lectures yesterday. Obama also, a son of this continent. A great speech. By the way, I must say that about that speech of Obama. I don't think you would have made such a speech as a candidate, because you've got to be guarded. I don't think when he was president and having missiles, he would have made that speech. He's free of the shackles of office, and that's why he spoke like that. Comrade Lumumba carries the name of a leader on the continent who was betrayed. Patrice Lumumba, chained with wire and sold to the CIA, finally was killed in Congo. We speak about betrayal today, and this time we say it's Nelson Mandela who has betrayed. I think we should accommodate those voices so we can hear who they are, where they come from, and so on. Because there are very few voices, but it's a loud message to say this person sold out. If Madiba sold out, then Walter is a sellout. She's a sellout. Then I would like to have a T-shirt that says, me too, I'm a sellout, if Mandela sold out. Because I think the mistake here of these discordant voices on the assault of Madiba's integrity, his legacy, is that it comes from people who lacks, I don't think it's really malice. Some of them are young, some are old, should have known better. But I think it comes from the misunderstanding of the epoch, what it is that you judge Nelson Mandela for. You can't judge me for bringing artificial intelligence into the world when I've been sitting on Robben Island. My time as a freedom fighter, a warrior, was to bring what we have today. Madiba said, and during his epoch, liberation. All these values that my sister has referred to here, herself, a woman of quality. I wish this was about her. I admire her very greatly. Madiba's epoch, the period in which he lived, was a period of war, the armed struggle, liberation struggle, everything, conflict. And he had to resolve that. Part of it was that he was stuck in jail for many, many years. Came out for a short period of time, very, very, very harsh period of having to consult for consensus in the nation and produce a constitution that is referred to by the whole world, not a few voices here, as top amongst the top in the world. And but Nelson Mandela always said in his first speech that never again. In his last speech when he spoke at the ANC conference in Mafikeng, it's in your hands. I have done my part. Now, judge not Madiba for the epoch he was not there for. And he said, it's in your hands. So now the African National Congress, our own organization, produced other leaders whose mission was to take forward what Madiba could not take forward. He was an old man and was going. Now we can't say because certain things that are shortcomings, there's no perfection in struggle, particularly human struggle, because it's got all manner of things which you must consider, particularly when it comes to the economy. Political rights is very simple. The economy is complex. No country has solved that problem of the economy today. Socialist countries have collapsed and so on. Now, it's to say Mandela didn't do this, it's in your hands, he said. Do it. He created a platform.
Well, in fact, I have to come to you just on that note, because I remember a conversation you were having last week with councillors and senior government officials at local government, where you spoke of the need for both the current and future generations to perhaps recognize that what the Mandelas of this world did was what they could do with all its flaws. And we would do well to actually spend time finding like our place and our role in actually pursuing the dream that they may have faltered on.
Certainly. Mandela and his colleagues certainly left this world better than they found it. And I actually think they created a good basis for us to move forward. Ours is to look at what they accomplished and what is left to be still accomplished in terms of the journey towards an inclusive South Africa, and a South Africa where every person has a fair chance to be the best they can be. And moaning about what they did or didn't do is not enough. But also, if I may call you this, a comrade Tokyo here. Used to be my comrade. Right. If I may say, there's often even a misunderstanding about what Mandela did or didn't do. One of the things he gets blamed for is not enough was done on social justice. I remember in Rwanda, I ended up squandering a whole lot of my time trying to defend his legacy and say, if there was one president who was very consistent about the issue of equality and ending poverty, it was President Mandela. During his time, I joined the civil service during his time, and he had a two-pronged strategy: become globally competitive and meet basic needs. We had to do those things concurrently. Secondly, he was the one who was pushing us to create the Equality Act. I remember Dala Omar, being under enormous pressure to meet the constitutional deadline, which he did meet. We finalized the Equality Act. By 1998, we were done with it, and by 1999, the final version was concluded. But Mandela, you will remember, he handed over to Comrade Thabo Mbeki. 2000, Comrade Thabo Mbeki signed the Equality Act. And if the Equality Act has not been implemented, which is the most twisted part of our history, it has nothing to do with Madiba. Madiba made us write a constitution that spoke about equality being an aspirational principle, but equality includes taking measures to redress imbalances of the past. And then Section 9.2 speaks about legislation and other measures may be taken to advance equality. And then when we did the Equality Act, Dala Omar and Mandela pushed us to make sure that we don't go just anti-discrimination, that we include the positive measure side. And that was done. But the implementation of the positive measures hasn't been done to date. Nobody can explain that.
And while we're on that, earlier on today in Mvezo, former President Jacob Zuma speaking about how to eradicate part of the poverty and the inequality that we're facing, and he points to the land issue, bringing it up as part of his broader speech. And what would Madiba's approach to land have been, and quote unquote that land expropriation without compensation is one of the key programs that will take forward Madiba's vision of a completely free South Africa to achieve total emancipation for the black majority. Perhaps if I can get your views on that, I'll begin with you, Mr. Sexwale.
Well, let me just join the tail end of what my sister Thuli was saying about the various pieces of legislation that had to be passed, because I was the premier, it's part of the process, and where things were done in terms of legislation, policies, and so on, and yet they were not implemented. So you can't point a finger at Nelson Mandela again when he said, here it is, it's in your hands. Even Section 25, if that Section 25 was not in the Constitution, where it says, all sorts of things about amending the constitution and so on. That door is even open. If Mandela was a dictator, this constitution would be written, then finally no one has got the right to even amend this constitution. It's finished. I've sold out to whites. But at that time, we had to, step by step. This country was going up in flames, and nobody fears war more than those who have entered it. The country was not even there. So Madiba had to hold the country together. And then we reached certain compromises, but kept the door open even for the constitution itself to be amended going forward responsibly, so that certain things should be achieved. So the point of land falls within that area. What it is that you can do, what it is that you can change. It's true, the state has got a lot of land that it still has to give, hand over to people. Now, let's go back to my own experience, Minister of Human Settlements. There is no minister who needs more land than human settlements, because we are not speaking not about housing. It is now the Department of Ministry of Human Settlements everywhere. That's why, Thuli, you made it your business at one stage to go out on your own to audit this department, to see what we can do in terms of sanitation, housing, and so on. So we needed land. And I found that there's a lot of land that is still in the Ministry of Defense, land in land affairs, that we ourselves, it's all over the place, that we could not even audit. Let alone talking about taking new land. Of course, land without, taking over land without expropriating, without compensation, should be a reality, not just populism. It must be done within certain confines. It must be done with certain objectives, very clear, must be very clear for food security, all those issues. But it's something that is doable. You can change the constitution and do that. So we can't blame Mandela when he left the door open. But had the dictator Nelson Mandela said, that's it, then we would have said he sold us out. There's a process here. There's progress that must be measured. There's auditing. There's responsible implementation of these policies. But they're open. So don't blame him when now it's in your hands. We look backwards and say, only one man. And he kept on saying, the collective, this or that. So the land issue is very important. Taking over land without expropriation. By the way, we do it all the time. When we had to do certain things within our department, we did. But in this particular case, there is a lot of land hunger on the part of our people. We must be very sure that as we do the no expropriation without compensation thing, when we do that, we must be sure that the project is right. There should be funds, education, because people are going to take land and some of them don't know what to do with it, and so on. I've given over a lot of land and people are just sitting on it. Make sure that they know how to utilize land. And land is, it's not only expropriation of land without compensation for housing, for agriculture, also for factories. People want to build other projects. So we must look bigger, and there must be sufficient capital to invest in education, to train people how to handle that. It's a good project. It must be done very well and responsibly.
Right.
Oh, I thought you're giving Prof the opportunity to answer a question, as you said.
Right. Well, firstly, just going back to housing being an area that needs land, and I agree with former Minister Sexwale, and just maybe to acknowledge you in public, your accountability. When we dealt with you as a minister, you always dealt with us the way Madiba would have dealt with us, that openness.
You're wrong, I'm scared of you.
Well,
I'm scared of the public behind you.
Well, you were, and actually politicians should be scared of the public behind us. And I like the part about being scared of the public, not fellow officials. Yes. But I think we enjoyed that accountability. I must say, being not a politician, being somebody who deals with the community, I've just come from Dlamini and the community there on our Enterprising Communities project linked with Mandela Day. They don't see land as a silver bullet to their lives. They see being an enterprising community as an answer to their lives. And their complaint is that they're not seeing their democracy dividend. And their democracy dividend are opportunities that are created in terms of supporting enterprises, providing information about markets, etc., etc. They want information also about intellectual property rights, because a lot of these young people create things that get stolen as intellectual property because they don't know about it. One kid, for example, died. The kid who drew the stadium that is now Moses Mabhida Stadium died. Government stole his intellectual property. He died poor. So that has nothing to do with land.
The stadium was built at one stage by a company.
Well, no, the architect.
I understand. I'm just saying it's very interesting.
It's a long story.
This thing, yes.
It's a long story. But the first time I heard the story was long even before it went to court. It was a former Mayor Madiba who told me about the theft of the intellectual. This young kid built it. As young kids in the townships always do, they don't go draw things. They make things. They make little cars. They make these things. So he made this thing, goes to Mayor Madiba, and he says, this could be a stadium. And Mayor Madiba is excited, gives it to his team, and say, work with this kid before anything happens. I'm architect, appropriates it. And so it's a long story, but for me, one of my passions is to protect intellectual property and teach our people about intellectual property rights. But let's go back to land. I think it's wrong of politicians to suggest to our people that land is going to solve all problems. Firstly, there won't be enough land for everyone. We've got 57 million people, and probably maybe 20 million of them do. But secondly, with the urban problem, the land we need most is the land that we need for housing. And it's needed desperately. So for people to suggest that we should take land away from government, it's dangerous. In fact, part of the reason we're struggling with government not having land is that government randomly offloaded its own stock and then ended up without land. And when it offloaded its own stock, you always find that government sells land for next to nothing, but buys land at a fortune. There's a lot of horror stories, particularly in Mpumalanga, where land that is almost adjacent to each other. When government sells, it's next to nothing. When government buys, Cape Town also, we had a case where government just bought land for a fortune, inexplicable, ICC. But I want to say, dear colleagues, yes, we must solve this land question fast. But if we solve it badly, sir, it is actually going to cause the very same poverty that we're trying to end, because we want everyone to be on board in terms of the way forward. And Madiba would never have said the single solution to access to land redistribution and land restitution is expropriation without compensation. I think Madiba would have looked at Section 25 and says, what have we done with Section 25 to date? And have we exhausted its potential? And if not, can we exhaust that potential? Because I think Madiba's concern was all on board should feel comfortable, all on board should feel we're South Africans, and all on board should be committed to adding value to the new South Africa. There shouldn't be people who feel they are the new Cinderellas, and if they feel the new Cinderellas, they might sabotage the way forward. The way, if people know that hunchback story in Rome, how after the 300 fighters won the war, the reality was somebody felt left behind and he sold them. And we don't want any South African to feel this is no longer their home.
I think it's a combination of both, what my sister says, Thuli. A combination of both. A clear understanding of, have we done what needed to be done under Section 25? That's part of it. Another part is there's a lot of land held by people, particularly by white people, large tracts of lands which are not being used. So you combine that, but you must address this Section 25. Have you done your work yourself? Have you done, because it's open, it was drafted and Madiba drafted that. So if the answer is that all that is done, we're still short, fine. But we've got to have that approach, which is balanced as you do that. So like I say, land expropriation without compensation was being a good project. It's correct that you must balance it with your own work.
All right, I'm going to have to interject a little bit there so we can take a very short break. And of course, we'll continue our conversation in a moment. Stay with Newsnight.